evolution has got just as much a religious root as, say, any creation theory. Because so often what I come up against is that the idea that evolution is science, creation or any other kind of origins belief is religion. Well, when you look back into history and see where evolution came from, how it developed historically as a theory, of course long before Darwin, then you find it had a very religious origin. And it's always existed down through Western history for at least 2,500 years as the idea that there is a great continuity in space and time, what was often called the great chain of being. But the idea behind that idea of great chain of being was the idea that the only way we can have a rational understanding of the world is on the assumption that it has a unity and an order. And the only way it was thought that that could be if somehow behind everything there was a great continuity, that everything was linked to everything else. Everything in the end was ultimately one. Really, it's a bit of an incoherent idea. I'd say it's really actually an irrational idea. But nevertheless, that was how it was passed down from the ancient Greeks right the way down through history. And Darwin was very much aware of that tradition and very much identified with it. And he and most of his generation talked about the principle of continuity, which is not a scientific principle, but just simply this idea that the whole of reality is some kind of genealogical continuity. And that principle of continuity, as they call it, was seen as the only possible naturalistic basis for reason and science. And to this day, you'll find many a scientist, totally unaware of where the idea comes from, talking about this or that must be so because of the principle of continuity. Well, if you come across that kind of statement, and it's very common in books and papers and articles, then beware the fact it comes from this tradition. There is no such scientific principle. It's a philosophical assumption. So Darwinism, in reality, equals naturalism plus rationalism plus evolutionism. Evolution, the idea of continuity. Rationalism, the belief in reason. Naturalism, belief that nature, physical nature, is really all there is. And I must put up there are loads of quotes one could give from scientists today, but this famous one from Richard Levant, I'm sure someone must have put it up before at one of these meetings. It's not that the methods and institutions of science, he wrote, somehow compel us to accept a material explanation for the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. I have great respect for Richard Levant because he is impeccably honest about his assumptions and commitments. And if there's time, I'll give some further quotes from him later on in this talk, not about evidence as such, but in other areas too, where he is far more honest in terms of the evidence than many other scientists. And, in distinguishing what is his commitments and assumptions and what are empirical findings. So I have great respect for him in a way that I haven't for people like Dawkins. Anyway, that's all just background to what's coming next. Oh yes, just a few just other points. Another thing that I wanted to test out in doing my research was the fact that there are actually two foundational laws in biology. If you do biology courses at university, they're not likely to be presented as such, despite the fact they clearly are. And those two laws are the law of biogenesis and the law of heredity. The law of biogenesis, of course, is simply the law that living things arise only from other living things. It's a very simple law, and yet it's been confirmed by billions of people as far back as history goes, and no one has ever come up with any exception to it, even though, as we know from the history of science, numerous people over recent centuries have professed to find exceptions to it. but it's always proved not to be the case. Of course, there's been a lot of research on the origin of life, and without summarising that, again, I think you have had talks on that, haven't you, here? So just to say that all the origin of life research has bequeathed us abysmal results and seemingly insurmountable problems. Most experiments have been done, though it's not really very well reported in the literature, but most experiments just simply produce a mixture of very red complex oils and black tars, black or brown tars, is essentially what you end up with, not with the molecules of life. The second one is the law of heredity, that living things not only arise only from other living things, but always from other living things of the same kind. And again, despite all the research, all the experiments, all the investigations, again, no acceptance of that have been found either. You can breed as many varieties of cats as you like, but you still end up with cats. You can breed as many varieties of dogs as you like, but you still end up with dogs. Or E. coli, or species of bacteria, or roses, or cabbages. It doesn't matter what organism you take. However, the wonder and diversity of the varieties that you produce, you still end up with fundamentally the same kind of organism. And I say those two laws are the most rigorously tested, confirmed in the whole of biology. Almost I can say in the whole of science. Well, except perhaps that the fact the sun rises and sets every day probably has even more evidence for it, but you know what I mean. We'll skip those. That's just repeating the same thing again. Oh, just a quote from, as bacteria are the ones which have been subjected to more experimental treatments and more breeding experiments than anything else, we've probably gone through thousands of generations of some bacterial species. And yet Alan Linton could write a few years ago in the THES, he's a professor of bacteriology at Bristol, retired now. Throughout 150 years of the science of bacteriology, he wrote, there is no evidence that one species of bacteria has changed into another. And I can say, it wouldn't particularly bother me if one species actually had changed. That's a kind of variation that wouldn't particularly faze me. But even so, he concludes not even that has been found, observed, or demonstrated. And behind that, though, again, it's a topic I don't want to cover tonight, is the whole idea of information. That the kind of changes and variations that we're talking about in a Darwinian framework involve the creation of thousands, millions, even billions of bits of new information. And yet, stubbornly, there is no evidence that natural processes can generate large amounts of new functional information. Functional structures in biology, particularly molecular structures, turn out to be tiny oases in vast deserts of non-function. And no naturalistic mechanism have yet been discovered that can cross those deserts. Again, science and evidence of this sort is such that one can never say that you can prove or disprove anything, but the very least I'd want to suggest that a theory like Darwinism that lacks that kind of crucial support can hardly be regarded as a robust theory. But that's background. I want to come now on towards my actual fish, which are the delight of my heart. But when I first started working on my cichlid fishes, and I'll say more about them in a moment, I did some preliminary research. I thought, well, one ought to just have a look at the fossils and just see what the evidence is for the evolution of this particular group of fish. I'd also, by that time, found out that the university had appointed as my external examiner Dr. Humphrey Greenwood, who happened at that time to be assistant director of the Natural History Museum in London. So I had a dual purpose for going up to visit that museum as much as possible. One, because they had the greatest, and still have, the greatest collection of fossil fishes in the world. And also because I wanted to get to know Humphrey Greenwood and find out as much about him as I could, as any self-respecting PhD student will do. And so I started to look at the fossils of fishes, and spent many delightful hours with Humphrey Greenwood looking at the fossil fishes in the British Museum. It was a very interesting time because this, I say, was back in the late 60s, early